The first alerts began flashing across international news desks just after sunrise in the Middle East, interrupting routine broadcasts with a chilling headline that immediately sent shockwaves through diplomatic and military circles. Initial reports were fragmented and confusing, but one detail was clear enough to trigger immediate alarm across global capitals. Intelligence sources were warning that an operation linked to Iran had targeted Israeli leadership, and the first 90 minutes after the alert would quickly become some of the most intense and closely watched moments in modern Middle Eastern geopolitics. Inside government crisis rooms from Washington to Brussels, analysts were already trying to verify what exactly had happened. Early information suggested that security forces surrounding Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had been forced into emergency protocols after intelligence warnings indicated a possible targeted threat connected to Iranian networks. Within minutes, the Israeli security apparatus activated one of its highest levels of protective response, deploying additional security units and temporarily restricting movements around several government locations. What made the situation so explosive was not only the threat itself, but the geopolitical context surrounding it. Tensions between Israel and Iran had already been escalating in recent months through a series of shadow confrontations, cyber incidents, and indirect clashes across the region. Both countries have long viewed each other as strategic adversaries, but they typically operate through covert actions and regional proxies rather than direct confrontation. That unwritten rule had helped prevent the rivalry from spiraling into open conflict. But now something felt different. As the first hour of the crisis unfolded, security agencies across Israel began tightening protective measures around key government officials, including those connected to Benjamin Netanyahu. Military helicopters were reportedly placed on standby, while intelligence teams raced to determine whether the warning represented a credible operational threat or a sophisticated disinformation campaign designed to provoke panic. Meanwhile, the name of another key figure began appearing in the background of intelligence briefings: Ali Khamenei. Although no direct public statement had been issued from Tehran, analysts quickly noted that any operation targeting Israeli leadership would carry enormous strategic implications and would almost certainly require approval from the highest levels of Iran's political and security establishment. The mere possibility that such a scenario was unfolding instantly raised the stakes across the entire region. Television networks across the Middle East switched to continuous coverage. Reporters outside Israeli government buildings described an unusual surge of security activity. Armored vehicles appeared along certain roads near sensitive locations. Police units quietly redirected traffic while journalists attempted to piece together the rapidly evolving story. Inside Israel's security community, however, the focus remained on the clock. Those first 90 minutes were critical because intelligence professionals understand that early signals during a crisis often reveal whether a threat is isolated or part of something larger. If the alert represented a single failed operation, the situation might stabilize quickly. But if the intelligence pointed toward a coordinated effort, the implications could be far more dangerous. As analysts reviewed intercepted communications and surveillance reports, new fragments of information began surfacing. Some suggested that a network linked to Iranian intelligence might have been attempting to monitor or track the movements of senior Israeli officials. Other sources hinted that the operation could involve digital surveillance combined with on-the-ground observation intended to test security vulnerabilities. At that stage, however, very little was confirmed. The fog of crisis was thick. Meanwhile, inside the office of Benjamin Netanyahu, advisors were reportedly assessing the political and military consequences of the situation even before full intelligence confirmation had arrived. Any credible evidence of a targeted threat linked to Iran would force Israel's leadership to consider potential responses that could dramatically escalate an already volatile regional rivalry. Across the region, governments were watching closely. Security officials in neighboring countries quietly increased monitoring of Iranian communications and military movements. Diplomatic channels began exchanging urgent messages seeking clarification. The fear among many observers was that a targeted threat against a sitting prime minister could trigger retaliatory actions capable of igniting a broader confrontation. But at the center of the unfolding drama remained a simple question that no one could yet answer. Was the intelligence warning the discovery of a genuine assassination plot, or the opening move in a much larger geopolitical operation designed to reshape the balance of power between Israel and Iran? As the first 90 minutes of the crisis came to an end, the answer was still emerging. But one thing had already become clear to every government watching the situation unfold. Whatever had just happened, the fragile equilibrium that has long defined the shadow conflict between Israel and Iran had suddenly been pushed into dangerously unpredictable territory. As the first 90 minutes of the crisis came to a close, the atmosphere inside Israel's security command centers had already shifted from confusion to controlled urgency. Intelligence officers, military planners, and political advisors were now working from the same assumption. Even if the immediate threat against Benjamin Netanyahu had been contained, the broader implications of the incident could not be ignored. Something had triggered one of the most serious security alerts in recent memory, and until the origin and intent were fully understood, the entire situation remained volatile. Inside Israel's national security apparatus, investigators began reconstructing the timeline minute by minute. Analysts examined surveillance data, intercepted communications, and intelligence reports gathered from multiple agencies. What they were looking for was not simply proof of a threat, but evidence of coordination. A single suspicious signal could represent misinformation or a misunderstanding, but if multiple intelligence streams pointed in the same direction, the situation could be far more serious. And according to early reports emerging from Israeli media, there were indeed several signals that had raised alarms simultaneously. One source reportedly involved unusual communications traffic detected by Israeli cyber intelligence teams. Another came from human intelligence networks operating across the region. Neither piece of information alone confirmed the existence of an attack plan, but together they created enough concern to trigger an emergency response around the movements and locations associated with Benjamin Netanyahu. Meanwhile, the political leadership in Israel was already confronting a difficult dilemma. Publicly acknowledging the full details of the intelligence could risk exposing sensitive sources and methods. Yet remaining silent might allow speculation to spiral out of control, both inside the country and internationally. Within hours, reporters were already asking questions outside government offices, trying to determine whether the security alert represented a credible assassination attempt or something less direct but equally dangerous. At the same time, attention quickly turned toward Tehran. Officials in Iran had not yet issued any formal response addressing the reports circulating in international media. The absence of immediate comment only intensified speculation among analysts studying the situation. Because if the operation truly involved networks linked to the Iranian state, it would almost certainly fall within the strategic framework overseen by Ali Khamenei, whose authority extends across Iran's military and intelligence structures. Yet geopolitics rarely operates in simple, transparent ways. The relationship between Iran and Israel has long been defined by indirect confrontation rather than open warfare. Over the years, tensions have manifested through cyber operations, covert intelligence activities, and proxy conflicts across the Middle East. Both sides understand that a direct escalation carries enormous risks for the entire region. That is why the events unfolding around the alleged targeting of Benjamin Netanyahu were attracting such intense international scrutiny. If the intelligence warning proved accurate, it could represent a significant departure from the traditional patterns of shadow conflict between the two nations. Inside Washington, senior officials were closely monitoring the situation as it developed. The United States has long maintained deep security cooperation with Israel, and any credible threat against the Israeli Prime Minister immediately triggered consultation between intelligence agencies and diplomatic channels. American analysts began asking the same questions being debated inside Israel. Was the alert evidence of a direct operational plot, or could it have been part of a broader intelligence operation designed to test Israeli security systems or gather information about protective protocols? These questions mattered enormously because the interpretation would influence how Israel and its allies chose to respond. Meanwhile, Israeli political circles began experiencing a surge of internal debate. Some security experts argued that the incident underscored the growing boldness of Iran's regional posture. Others warned that reacting too aggressively before confirming the facts could unintentionally escalate tensions. The Israeli public was also beginning to feel the psychological impact of the unfolding story. Television channels interrupted normal programming to cover the developing situation. Analysts debated the meaning of the intelligence warnings, while reporters outside government buildings described the heightened security presence surrounding officials connected to Benjamin Netanyahu. For many citizens, the sudden surge in protective measures served as a reminder of how fragile regional stability can be. Meanwhile, in diplomatic circles across Europe and the Middle East, officials began quietly reaching out to both Israeli and Iranian representatives seeking clarity. Governments understood that misinterpretations during moments of crisis can quickly spiral into confrontation. A misunderstanding between two rival states, especially in a region already filled with geopolitical tension, could trigger consequences far beyond the original event. Yet, even as diplomats searched for answers, intelligence analysts were uncovering additional details that complicated the picture further. Some reports suggested that the suspicious activity linked to the alert might have involved surveillance networks rather than an immediate attack. If true, that could indicate an attempt to map the security routines surrounding Israeli leadership rather than execute a direct strike. But such operations can carry their own dangers, because gathering intelligence about a leader's movements is often the first stage in planning something far more serious. As the second phase of the crisis unfolded and investigators continued analyzing every available clue, the world found itself watching a tense geopolitical mystery take shape in real time, and beneath the uncertainty, one reality was becoming increasingly clear to governments across the region. Even if the immediate threat had passed, the fragile shadow conflict between Israel and Iran had just entered a far more unpredictable and dangerous chapter. As the investigation continued moving deeper into the second day, the story surrounding the alleged targeting of Benjamin Netanyahu had already evolved from a sudden security alert into a full-scale geopolitical crisis being analyzed across the world. What initially appeared to be a single intelligence warning was now unfolding into something far more complex, drawing in global powers, intelligence agencies, and regional governments, trying to understand whether the balance of power in the Middle East had just shifted. Inside Israel's national security establishment, analysts were now studying patterns rather than isolated clues. Intelligence agencies understand that sophisticated operations rarely rely on a single signal. Instead, they often unfold through layers of activity: digital surveillance, communication testing, logistical preparation, and human intelligence gathering. When investigators began aligning the fragments of information collected during the first 90 minutes of the alert, they discovered something unsettling. Some of the signals suggested a coordinated intelligence effort rather than a random event. Cyber monitoring units reported unusual probing of Israeli government communication networks in the hours leading up to the alert. Meanwhile, surveillance teams reviewing regional intelligence traffic detected movement patterns that appeared unusually synchronized. None of these indicators proved the existence of a direct attack plan, but together they raised the possibility that Israeli leadership had been under structured observation, and that possibility carried enormous strategic implications. Because if networks linked to Iran had been attempting to map security routines surrounding Benjamin Netanyahu, it would suggest a level of planning that could not be dismissed as coincidence. Such activities typically fall within the domain of state-level intelligence operations, efforts that often operate quietly in the background long before any direct action occurs. Attention quickly returned to Tehran, where political silence continued to dominate official channels. No confirmation or denial had been issued by Iranian authorities, leaving analysts to interpret the situation based largely on indirect signals and historical patterns. In Iran's political system, decisions involving sensitive intelligence operations ultimately fall under the authority of Ali Khamenei, whose influence extends across the country's security institutions. However, the absence of public statements does not necessarily reveal intent. Iran and Israel have spent decades navigating a shadow conflict defined by ambiguity. Both sides regularly accuse the other of covert operations ranging from cyber attacks to targeted sabotage, yet official acknowledgments are rare. This strategic ambiguity allows governments to signal strength while avoiding the escalation that could follow a directed mission. But the situation surrounding the threat alert had now reached a scale that made complete silence increasingly difficult. Across the Middle East, governments were watching closely. Regional leaders understood that a credible threat against the Israeli prime minister could trigger reactions capable of destabilizing the already fragile security environment. Intelligence agencies in neighboring countries began quietly increasing monitoring of military activity, communication channels, and cross-border movements. Meanwhile, inside Israel, the political implications were growing. Supporters of Benjamin Netanyahu argued that the intelligence warning demonstrated the seriousness of the threat posed by Iran's regional posture. They insisted that the incident reinforced long-standing Israeli concerns about the strategic intentions of Tehran's leadership. Others urged caution. Some security analysts warned that interpreting the alert too quickly could lead to decisions based on incomplete information. Intelligence operations often involve deception, counterintelligence, and deliberate misinformation. In such an environment, even experienced analysts must carefully separate verified evidence from speculation. The media environment added another layer of pressure. International television networks began running continuous coverage of the unfolding story, while political commentators debated whether the incident represented a turning point in the decades-long rivalry between Israel and Iran. Headlines across Europe and North America described the situation as one of the most serious intelligence confrontations in recent years. Inside Washington, policymakers were also becoming increasingly involved. The United States maintains a deep strategic alliance with Israel, and any credible threat against Israeli leadership carries immediate implications for American foreign policy. U.S. intelligence officials were reportedly sharing information with Israeli counterparts while simultaneously evaluating the broader regional consequences. Because if the situation escalated beyond intelligence warnings and into open retaliation, the effects could spread rapidly across multiple theaters of geopolitical tension. Energy markets were already reacting cautiously to the uncertainty. The Middle East remains one of the world's most critical energy-producing regions, and investors know that political instability there can influence global prices within hours. Even the possibility of escalating conflict between Israel and Iran was enough to trigger nervous reactions in financial markets. Yet perhaps the most dangerous element of the crisis was the uncertainty surrounding intent. If the intelligence signals represented early-stage reconnaissance for a future operation, Israel might interpret that as justification for preventive measures. If, on the other hand, the activity was part of a broader intelligence contest designed to gather information rather than carry out an attack, an aggressive response could unintentionally escalate the situation. This ambiguity is what makes shadow conflicts so unpredictable. Governments operate in an environment where information is incomplete, motives are obscured, and decisions must often be made before all facts are known. Under those conditions, the margin for miscalculation becomes dangerously small. As international attention continued to intensify and investigators in Israel analyzed every fragment of intelligence collected during the first 90 minutes of the crisis, the story had clearly grown beyond a single security alert. It had become a test of restraint, strategy, and political judgment between two long-standing adversaries. And as the world waited to see how leaders in Jerusalem and Tehran would interpret the signals now emerging from the shadows, one unsettling reality was beginning to dominate the conversation among global analysts. Sometimes in geopolitics, the most dangerous moments are not when attacks occur, but when both sides believe they might be coming next.